Hi, I'm William, and this is the first After Effects training. So I have been working in After Effects and visual stuff, so 3D and design for a long time. After Effects is kind of one of the things that really got me into doing animation and stuff like that, so I really enjoy it. So this is the first of the After Effects things, but I also do mostly Blender stuff on my Twitch channel, which I also upload onto YouTube. I also enjoy doing texture stuff, so Substance Painter and stuff. If you're into 3D stuff, you can check that out. So today we're going to start with just the basics with After Effects and work from there. So if you don't know, After Effects is basically like the industry standard for motion graphics, compositing, special effects, that sort of stuff. It's used in big budget movies, adverts, animating text, all these sort of things. This is what you do in After Effects. And we'll get to the basics of most of that throughout the next few lessons. And I hope you enjoy. So let me just start a new project so you can just sort of see what it would look like when you start up. So there's lots of different panels and stuff, so it's a little bit different to what you would expect from Photoshop. If your screen is looking a bit different than mine with like things in different places, you can go to the window workspace and say standard. And if it still looks a bit different, you can just say reset standard to default, but it should sort of look something like this. Okay, so After Effects is a sort of video compositing and stuff like that. So what that means is you combine images and video and layer them on top of each other. So basically all the same stuff that you would know from Photoshop you can do, but you've got the added dimension of going through time. So the basic canvas that you would know from Photoshop is a composition. So you'll see that you should have little windows in the middle here saying new composition. I see mine sort of flickering. I think that's just from the screen recording, which is a little bit weird. So you can say new composition, and that'll give you this little window. Okay, so the composition is basically like your canvas in Photoshop. But you're going to have like a few more settings to worry about. And the first one is actually, it's got a name here. So this is one thing I'm going to advise you from the start when you're working in After Effects is to actually name your comps. So you might be working in a project where you just have one, but you might also have a project where you have 50. So naming these will really help you find stuff. So let's just call this lesson 1. Okay, so you'll see you've got basic, advanced, and 3D render settings over here, different panels. We're only going to look at the basic stuff today. And basically you get the width and the height, which is going to be the size of your video. And if you know from like YouTube or Netflix or whatever, you get 1080p, 4K. When your YouTube is going slow, 360p or whatever. So that's generally called by the height. So that would be like 1920 by 1080, which is standard full HD. So that would be 1080p. So that's the height of the video. So you also get under presets a whole bunch of defaults. It's not so much a thing these days, but NTSC and PAL were like Europe and America had different formats for that. Generally, you're not going to be worrying about that these days, but if you get like, you go and work in TV, you might need to worry about PAL and stuff, but at that point, you should know what you're going to need. But if you have a project that has a specific need, you should get specifications. So that'll be your width and height. And then the next important thing is the frame rate. So you'll see here, it's defaulting to 30. That's 30 frames per second. So that means in 1 second, you'll have 30 images that After Effects will be calculating. So 30 is standard for like web video. TV or film might be 25. You'll see that there's a little drop down with common rates over here. 29.97 is like one of these weird holdovers, I think, from PAL, where it sort of rounds out. Generally, you're going to have specifications when you get a project. So it'll be 25, 30, 60 will be sort of what you get for like high refresh rate things. So like videos on YouTube, you get a lot smoother looking stuff. If you're doing a complicated project in After Effects, though, that will mean it's going to have to calculate 60 frames per second. So that's going to be double the amount of data After Effects calculates. So unless you've got a specific need to do that, or your project is simple, you don't need to actually go that high. So generally, I'd say 30. Your project specifications will get that. Pixel aspect ratio. This is where things get weird. Generally, you're going to want to have that on square pixels so that your pixels on screen are square. These other formats is for like old TV stuff where the image would be stretched and squashed in certain ways. You shouldn't have to worry about that, but for some formats, that's necessary. And yeah, then the next important thing is duration and the time code over here. So this can be a bit confusing for the first time you use it. You see it saying 0001000. So what that's actually saying is that the composition I'm going to create now is going to be 10 seconds long, not 10 minutes. It's the last number is frames. So what you have set here for 30 frames per second. So if I go 30 at the end there, you'll see it bumps up to 11 seconds. So you can have a composition that's 11 seconds and 15 frames long. You know, who knows? And then the second set of numbers here would be the minutes. So if I put 1 there, that would mean it's 1 minute, 11 seconds, 15 frames long. And then if you're doing some crazy project, you might have 2 hours, minutes, seconds, frames. So that's just important to know that the last number is frames, then it's seconds, then minutes, then hours. Start time code is basically just saying that this is the time that this composition starts at. Leave it at 0 unless you really have a specific need for some project, I don't know. So just leaving it at 0 is 99% of the time what you're going to do. And then you do get an option to choose a background color. So you can have it black or red or white or whatever. Not super important, but if you're just doing a simple background, that's fine. So all this just to set up your project, but it's important to know all these little things over here. So then you say OK, and then you'll get your composition. And you can always resize these different things here. So this is where you're going to be seeing what's actually shown in your video. You can zoom in or out with the mouse wheel. And a super handy thing to know is that you can say fit over here. So you see it's saying 50%. When I zoom in, it's saying 100. If you click on that, it will drop down and you can say fit, and then it will just fit the whole screen into this little window over here. So then when you resize it, it will stay. In Photoshop, you've got your little layer list where you've got all your different layers and things that you're going to be, your text and images or whatever. In After Effects, that is this panel at the bottom over here. So this is your timeline, which is where you get your layers and the timeline. So this is the section that shows you the length of your whole comp. So you see as I click and drag along over here, this little blue slider. This is called scrubbing. If you ever hear in like a tutorial or something online, this is scrubbing through the timeline. So it's just scrubbing along the time over here. And you'll see that since I made this 2 minutes and 1 minute and 11 seconds and 15 frames or whatever, if I go right to the end, on the left-hand side here, you can see the current time that we're sitting at. So that's 2 hours, 1 minute, 11 seconds. So you don't generally want to have a comp this long, but so you can see, you can scrub through it over here. You can see the actual time that you're at. You can also just click and drag on that to move it along in time. And also right below that time number, you'll see a few digits over there, and that's actually saying exactly what frame you're on. So this is saying it's on frame 87,000 or this comp. So let me actually make this a more reasonable time length. So if you ever made a mistake with your comp where you want to extend it or something, so it wasn't long enough for what you were doing, just go to the menu over here, composition settings. So then you can change the settings with this. So I'm just going to make this 10 seconds long. So now when I scroll through the timeline, I'm just going from 0 to 9 seconds, 29 frames. That's actually correct. It's because it's starting at 0. So, okay, so now you want to actually start getting some stuff in your project. You'll see that by default, you'll have this little panel on the left-hand side, and this is called the project panel. And you'll see in here, I've got one little thing, lesson 1 composition. So that's what we just created. So in here, it basically shows you every single item that's been put into your project. And you can quickly access different comps and things from here. I say comp, that just means composition. It should make sense. And it'll tell you what each of these items you've got over here. So this lesson 1 is a composition. You might have images, videos, sound, things like that. So you can quickly access these things by just double-clicking them and it will open them. This was already open, so that doesn't make any difference. Okay, so I'm going to add just a basic shape to this. So you can either click in your composition viewport or the timeline, doesn't matter which. And then on the menu at the top, under layer, say new, and then you get a bunch of different options over here for different types of things. We're just going to do a simple solid. So it should be the second on your list, solid. And then this gives you a little pop-up again. Basically everything After Effects gives you these sort of pop-ups. And you can choose a size. So by default, it's going to make it the size of your comp, but you can also just make it a specific size. So let's make it 500 pixels wide, 500 pixels tall. And you see you can choose actually units, so it's in pixels. You can do it in actual specific sizes, in inches or millimeters, or percent of the size of the comp. So you might have a specific need for that. If you want to make one and the size of your comp and it's not showing that size, there's a little button here to just make the solid fill up the entire comp. And then this, you can just pick a little color. And a neat little feature of After Effects is it will name this solid by the color that's picked in this thing. So if I change this, you'll see that it actually changes to sort of reflect the color. So let's just make this something bright so you can see. Yellow solid 1. You can of course rename this to whatever you want. And then when you say OK, you get a little solid and you'll see that it appears in your layer list over here. And you'll see it actually has a name there. And I double clicked on it, and this is a mistake that people often make, and then they wonder, like, I can't see anything else in my project. So you see that opened it up at the top here next to the comp. So it may look the same, but this is just seeing the entire, just this layer. And then if I switch at the top here to comp, I'm seeing the entire composition. So if ever all your other layers disappear, just check that you're actually in your composition, not looking at a specific layer. That's a long time to just get to adding a layer to a thing, but there's lots and lots of details we've got to get through into After Effects. It's fairly complicated. I'm trying to just keep to the basics today. Okay, so if I select yellow solid, you'll see we get little border selections around it. And from there, if you click on those, you can scale it. And you'll see that it scales around that little sort of target selector in the center there. So you can scale it to fit whatever size you want. And then if you just click and drag, you can move it around. Fairly simple so far. But now we're going to look at how you'll actually be using this when you're animating. So if you look in your layer list over here, you'll see that there's a little arrow next to it on the left-hand side. If you click that, you see it drops down with more settings, and you've got one that's called Transform. If you click on the Transform, then you'll see that it drops down a whole lot of other settings over here. So this is like the basic stuff that makes up this entire layer. So you see if I now click and drag this, the position values are changing over here. So if I move it all the way to the left-hand side, when that little target is sort of on the left-hand side over there, let's just match it up. So when that's 0, that means it's on the left-hand side of the frame. And that is the first number over there, which is X. So let me actually open up my other project over here. This might make it more sense for you. So this is basically just a little solid over here, and then I've got other layers just describing this. So if I move it to the left, the position on the X is moving, and that's left and right. If I move it up and down, that's position on the Y moving. So Y is up and down. So just like if you did maths in high school or whatever, for graphs, X and Y being, X being across, Y being up and down, it's basically exactly that. Okay, so let me just find just this layer. Okay, so if I zoom in over here, this one you'll see it has got that little target on the top left-hand corner. And that target is actually saying that this is the center of this layer, and that is the anchor point. So you see over here, under the transform, we've got anchor point. So if I change that, I'm just clicking and dragging, you'll see that it moves the object. What it's doing is it's actually sort of centering the layer around that point. So the position moves the anchor point, and the anchor point is what that layer is attached to, if that makes any sense. So you can edit these values by clicking on them, and you can type numbers into them. So the first number will always be X, the second number will be Y. So if you want to get to a specific position, you want it to be 250 pixels from the left-hand side of the screen and 500 pixels from the top of the screen. You can type in numbers there, or you can click and drag to move them, or you can click on your layer and just manually move it. So After Effects tracks all these specific things, and you can edit them all specifically so that you can animate them. And you'll see that you have all these with scale and rotation and opacity as well. So scale, the size of the object, if that makes sense, of course. And there's a little lock thing over here to constrain the size so it's even. And if you turn that off, you can make it just scale either vertically or horizontally. You'll notice that this is all happening around that anchor point. So if I move the anchor point to a different position, the scaling will scale around from a different position. So you'll see it sort of shrinks around that little sort of middle bit now. Whereas if I put it like outside the object or something and then scale it, it sort of moves the whole thing to scale around that point. So by combining these, you can sort of get interesting effects on how to scale your object. So the anchor point is actually quite an important thing to think about when you're positioning and animating your things. And rotation basically just rotates the layer around that point. So this is in degrees. So if you know, a circle has 360 degrees. So if I type 360, it'll just move back to the start position. And then you'll see that you've got two numbers over here. So when I went to 360, that first number increased. So that's After Effects tracking how many complete rotations it's done. So you can use this when you're animating to say, I wanted to rotate 20 times in positive direction. And you can also have negative numbers here. So you can have a negative rotations as well. So the last little thing in that transform list is opacity. And that's just in percent. So you can go from 100% to 0% to make your layer invisible or semi-visible. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense with the X and Y, because now we're going to get into, well, yeah, we're going to get into some basic animation. So create a new comp. I'm just going to quickly show you what we're going to create. This is like animation 101, which is just creating a simple bounce animation. So we're going to create a solid, and using just those things that I showed you, now we're going to try replicate bounce with a little bit of rotation and then squash and stretch. So if you look up, I think it's Disney's 12 Principles of Animation, squash and stretch are like one of the basics, and it's also like feeds into a thing called anticipation. So you see I've got this little box and it sort of squishes. So that's anticipation. Stretches as it's moving, so it gets a little bit longer as it's going fast. And then squishes when it hits, and then bounces. So we're going to recreate this, and yeah, it should be pretty fun. So I'm just going to create a new project and start this from scratch. So I'm going to create a new solid, and I'm just going to make a 250 pixel by 250 pixel solid, just so that it doesn't take up the whole screen. If you did create one that takes up the whole screen, you can just scale it down. So I'm just going to grab it and just put it on the left-hand side of the screen. And then you just scale this down. So what I'm going to do now is show you some simple keyboard shortcuts that make working with After Effects a bit easier. when you want to animate the bounce, probably the first thing you're going to want to do is work with the position. So a keyboard shortcut to get to the position value of a layer is to just press P with that layer selected. And you'll see that the position value pops up over there. So that's way easier than having, go click on this drop down, find the open up a transform, find position. You can just press P and get position. Okay, so at the moment, if I screw up through the timeline, of course, nothing's going to happen because there's no animation on here. To create an animation, you're going to do keyframing. So a keyframe is basically a way of telling After Effects, at this point in time, I want this thing to have that value. So to turn that on basically any single thing in After Effects, there's this little stopwatch icon over here. So if you click on that, it adds a keyframe at the current time. So if you had scrubbed through the timeline and you're on the other side, it'll add a keyframe wherever this timeline indicator is. So that's this little blue line. And you'll see that keyframe is this little diamond dot that sort of fits over here. You can click and drag that and move that anywhere in time. Basically, this is saying at 1 second, 25 frames, this object's position is X value of that, Y value of that. So if I move somewhere else now, and then once you've turned on the stopwatch, if you just move the object, it'll automatically add a keyframe. So now if I scrub through the timeline, this little box will move from that first position to the second one. And you'll see you also get a little path that shows up, this little motion path. So that's a simple just point-to-point motion. If you want to make this more interesting, the one way you can do it is just add more points. So it can move from one point to another. But that can start to get annoying to work with and complicated to sort of see. So I'm just going to actually select that individual keyframe that I just added and press delete, or you can press backspace to remove it. And when you have these motion paths showing up over here, if you just click on your layer, just like you have in Illustrator also, you can directly edit these motion paths. So if I just click and drag on one of these handles, I can change the shape of the path that this object will be moving. So that way you can just nicely refine the shape of the path and not have to go in and manually add, I want it to move to this point, and then I want it to move to this point before moving back to that point. Where you can have less keyframes, the better. It'll make your life a lot easier. Because then say you want to change this final position to be over here, you would now have to go back and change all these keyframes now to smooth out that motion. Whereas if you just worked with the motion path, so let's go here, then you can just change that in between bit. And this is actually an important concept, is the stuff that's happening in between the two keyframes is called a tween. Yeah, it's a silly word, but that just basically means in between. So tween, if you ever see that, that's just saying whatever After Effects is calculating between two keyframes. So that's one of the big tips I've got for you. Just try to use as few keyframes as possible. Okay, so let's start by just making some sort of bouncy motion over here. We go straight up, smooth the top, and then go down. Let's just move through the timeline a little bit, add another point. And since the bounce sort of, gets a little bit weaker as it bounces down, we're just going to make that height a little bit narrower. Less high. Tweak the path, just make it smooth bounces. And that's what's nice about this motion path. You can sort of see the path that you're getting over here. And you can click on individual points and just manually edit them. Okay, and you will see already that there's something weird going on over here, because the first bit that I created, you'll see it's got little dots fairly closely spaced, and then the next bit they're further apart, and then at this end bit they're very far apart. So what that actually is indicating is every one of those dots, I hope you can see it on the video, it might be hard to see, but each one of those dots is saying that's a frame and that's the position it will be at that frame. So if you follow the little anchor point, that little target in the center, it's sitting on each one of those dots on individual frames. And then when I go over here, you see that it's actually jumping between these dots, because each frame is a frame. It doesn't have anything between frames to see. So this is a good indication of sort of the speed of your animation without even playing it. If you just look at this path, you can see the gaps and stuff of how it accelerates and the jumping between these spots over here. So this is where practice will come in with After Effects. You might find that your timing, the first few times you create things, is just completely weird. But remember, you can always adjust these keyframes and move them around to change the timing of these things. So let's actually show you how you would play back your animation. It's really simple. There's keyboard shortcuts, but there should be a little panel on the right-hand side with preview and a little play button. And if you click that, the first time you play, it will be sort of jerky as it sort of loads the animation, and then it will play back properly. So you'll see that you get this sort of green bar on the timeline over here. So that's saying how far it's actually calculated. So let me just repeat this whole section. I'm assuming that's what you wanted. So I'm going to create a new composition, 10 seconds long, and it's just going to be a 1080 by 1080 at 30 frames per second. So to this, I'm going to add so under layer, new, solid. This time let's do 500 pixels by 500 pixels. You can do it rectangle if you want. And I just pressed enter there. It's an automatic reflex for me. So let me do that again. New solid, 500 by 500, and then you can choose a color, and then you can say okay, and I just automatically press enter because that's just how I'm used to working with it. Okay, so I'm going to move this just to the left hand side. You can animate yours bouncing from the right, you can animate yours bouncing from anywhere, but just easier to sort of understand when we move it from the left hand side. So I'm just going to select the layer, and I'm going to press P to open up the position. And then there's this little stopwatch icon over here. So you see if it's gray, you don't have keyframes turned on. And when you click it, it should turn blue, and that's keyframes are enabled for position. So you see that adds this little keyframe, little blue diamond over here because it's selected. and that's saying that this is the position for this current point in time. So I'm just going to scrub through the timeline, I don't know, a second and a half, and then I'm going to click and drag and then move this shape up. So then you get that motion path, and then you can start editing that by clicking on the handles. It actually might be a bit hard to see with red on red. Let me change. So I've got the layer selected. I'm going to say layer, solid settings. I'm just going to change it to a different color so you can see it under that path. So then I can drag that handle and change the shape of this path. So that's the first little half of the bounce. And then I'm going to go a little bit ahead, about the same amount of time. Drag and move it to sort of where we want. I'm going to adjust this path so it's smooth. Now I'm going to move ahead a little bit shorter time. Click and drag the object to move it up. And then if you don't see the little handles over here, you can just zoom in a little bit. You should be able to see it then. It's not actually letting me do that. It's actually because it's so close to that anchor point, but if you can't actually grab that handle, that's actually a good time for me to show you. So just like in Illustrator, there's a little pen tool at the top here. If you use the convert to vertex tool, so just like in Illustrator, that will change a sharp point to a round point. So if I click on the bottom sharp point there, you see that that makes that little rounded bit there. We don't actually want it to have that round motion there, so I'm just going to do Control Z to undo, Control Z. But you can do that on this point over here to just grab it if you can't grab that anchor or handle. But just make sure that you switch back to selection tool. So that's the default tool. You'll see that that's got a keyboard shortcut of V. Otherwise, you'll start drawing paths, which will make other weird things that you weren't expecting happen. So with the selection tool, then you can just grab your object again. So I'm going to move a little bit ahead, grab, drag down, and then just quickly repeat this for one last little bounce. You can do 5 bounces, you can do 3 bounces. I don't mind. So then I'm just going to adjust this so it looks however I want. You can also just select and edit each one of these individual points like this. So that's one way to work with it. You can also just go back and move and find your object and move it to see where you like it looking. The downside to that is if you just find a spot in the middle over here and you want it to actually be in this spot over here, it's going to add another keyframe over here, which can sort of make the animation a little bit weird and wonky. So that's why it's sometimes better to just work with the path instead of just moving around and adding in a whole lot of keyframes, which will then make it very difficult to edit your animation, unless that's specifically what you want your object to do. Because I created this with the first few bounces over here with a big gap between them, this motion path has a lot of dots on it, whereas the last ones where the keyframes are close together, there's less dots on here. So that's just meaning the action is happening faster. So I'm just going to press the space bar and you'll see that the animation loads up for a second and then plays back. So you see the speed is a little bit wonky. You might want to adjust these keyframes as well. But I think work with just getting the basic motion for now. You can, so if you have 2 objects, so say I've got this blue square over here, And I want to copy that to, let's just add a red one over here. So if I go to the red one, to position, you can go and select all the keyframes. So you're not going to copy the path itself, you're copying the keyframes. So if I select those keyframes there and say Control C, so that's copy, or you can say Edit, Copy. Then you select your other layer and then just make sure that you move to the correct time, because wherever you paste it, the first keyframe is going to go onto the current time indicator. So if I go Control V, you'll see it pastes those keyframes from this point. So they'll be at different times over there. But that's how you would do it. So one little other thing that I'm going to say now while you're still doing this, if your timing is weird and maybe it's just overall too fast or overall too slow, if you select all your keyframes that you want to adjust, and if you hold down the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Mac, and if you go to the last keyframe, you have to do this with the last keyframe, that's just how it works in After Effects. If you hold that down, so Alt or Option, and click and drag on that last keyframe, that'll scale all the keyframes together as, proportionally, so that they all stay the same rate. So I can make this whole little bit go faster. So now the red one will go twice as fast as the blue one. You can also do the opposite and make it super slow. So you can also do that on the first or the last. So the first or the last keyframe that you have selected, if you hold down Alt or Option, you can scale them all together. But if it's weird things like the first bounce being very slow, then you would have to sort of go and sort of adjust these keyframes and sort of grab and select them as a group and sort of adjust individual ones like this, so you can get the spacing over here. So this is really where practice will come in, and just seeing how the spacing looks and then just playing back and getting a feel for how these keyframes sort of respond. Okay, so for now we're just working on position. I'm going to repeat that all over again with just a new comp for anyone who is still not getting it. So I'm going to add a new layer. So I'm just, the new comp, standard settings, I'm not changing anything there. New solid, let's just do this one in green. So I'm making this one 250 by 250 pixels. Selecting it. And this one I'm going to just do in a slightly different way. So before I was clicking and dragging and moving it, but maybe I want to be a little bit more precise with this animation. So in this, I'm just going to move it there. I'm going to turn on the stopwatch. And then I'm going to add these keyframes just by adjusting these values over here. So I want it to go up. So I'm going to make the Y value smaller. And then I want it to move slightly to the right. So I'm just clicking and dragging the X value to move it to the right. And then if you want to be accurate and you want it to bounce like it's on a flat surface, you can look at this first keyframe. Let's make it a simple, easy to understand value. So I'm making that 800. So if I then move later on and add a keyframe here with 800, it'll drop down to the exact same height. So that's where you can just make sure things are looking accurate if that's what you want to go for your animation. So then we can just adjust the height. So remember the X and the Y, if you think of the top left-hand corner as being 0, 0, so Smaller numbers mean more to the left or more upwards. And you can also have negative numbers and have things move off the screen. But the motion graphs or paths are very useful for just seeing the whole sequence of your animation. If you have a very long animation, though, the paths only show up for, I can't remember exactly how long, but it's only a few seconds for each path. So if this animation was 2 hours long, you're not going to see the whole path for that object. It'll show you just the last few seconds. I think you can configure that somewhere, but don't worry about that for now. Okay, so I want to adjust this path now, just smoother sections in bits. So I'm just going to click on these, drag the handles to smooth out the top. And I mean, you don't have to recreate a perfect bounce. Maybe you just want to move your thing around the screen. I don't care. I can't see your thing. Do what you want. Just have fun. But this is like the basics of After Effects. If you don't understand this, you're going to really struggle from now on. So let's get this right. So you can press spacebar or numpad 0 to preview the animation. And it should just loop over the whole thing. Unless you've made your comp 10 minutes long, it should just loop back at the end of this thing over here after a few seconds. If you just want to preview a little section of your animation, so I'll just keep on throwing more things in here. Hopefully you're following. There's this little thing called the work area. So you'll see that there's this gray bar at the top of the timeline over here with little two blue indicators on the left and right. So this thick one is the work area. So if I grab the right-hand one and shrink that just to that first little half and grab the left hand with this gray bar, so that's shifting this work area. So now when I do a preview, so if I go into the middle over here and preview, it'll just loop in this section over here. So this way you can just fine tune one little section of your animation just to make sure it's feeling right without having to see the whole thing and waste your time. So if you really just want to fine tune this bottom bounce over here, you can just zoom in on the animation there and sort of see what it's doing. So I'm just going to complicate mine a little bit because so we can get some anticipation and stuff in this animation. So if you're still continuing with the bounce, don't worry about this. But like watching this, it bounces and it like immediately bounces, which is physically correct, but for like visual animation, having a little bit of a pause at the bottom can be a little bit more interesting. So I'm actually just going to start off showing you simple methods, and I'm just going to copy that keyframe. So Control-C'ing that keyframe and moving on a little bit. So we just got, and pasting it. So we've got like 2 frames, so we're just sitting at the bottom. And if I do that for each of these little bounces and just add 1 or 2 frames of the same keyframe, you'll see that when I play it back, it has this just a little bit more impact. You sort of feel that the thing is just being a little bit more deliberate in its motion. So it might be a little bit quick, long in that case, so maybe just 1 frame instead of 2 frames or something. But a lot of animation is sort of visual trickery. So it might not actually be physically accurate, but to the eye, it just feels a little bit better. So to copy the single frame, just click on an individual keyframe. So you'll see that the unselected ones are gray and the selected ones will be blue. Or you can just click and drag over an area just to select one or two sort of keyframes like that. And then just Control C and paste it wherever you want. And it'll always paste a keyframe at the current time of the timeline. Okay, so hopefully you're getting a little bit of bounce going on there. I'm going to show you one more thing for just the position to make things feel a little bit more interesting. So when you see something bouncing, usually it sort of slows down when it reaches the top of a bounce. So one simple way we can do that with just like the press of one button is when we scroll through here and we find the keyframes where it sort of gets to the top. If we select one of those keyframes and then press the F9 key. So depending on your laptop, you might have to press other keys to do that. But if you press F9, you'll see that you get this sort of hourglass shape. And this is called easy ease. So you'll see now when I play this, it might be a bit subtle to see, but it sort of gets to the top and then it sort of lingers for a second. If you don't have the F keys or something, you can do that same thing by selecting the keyframe that you want, right-clicking it, and say Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease. So you see it says F9 there. So basically what that does is it sort of slows down the motion just around that point, so it sort of eases into that position. We'll get into more detail a little bit later on what that exactly means. But basically, if I undo this and zoom in here, so this is just with the standard keyframe. If you look at the points around here on this path, you'll see that they've got even spacing, because this is using just automatically even spacing between the keyframes. If I press F9, if you look closely now at these dots, you'll see that they sort of space out, they get closer around this keyframe, and then more spaced out the further away from it. So that's how you get that sort of feeling of acceleration, because it's more spaced out in the one section and closer in the other. So if I now just go and I'm shift clicking on all the top bounce keyframes over here. So you see I'm just getting the little top bounces over here, so they're blue. Pressing F9 and then previewing, you get that sort of airy, sort of lingering feeling when they get to the top of the bounce. And just adding that easy ease thing to things where you just want a little bit of acceleration and just slightly nicer bit of motion is an easier way to make it feel better. Okay, so let me just open up one of my other bounces. I'm gonna hide the red solids. So just like in Photoshop, you can just turn on and off visibility of layers. So right on the left-hand side, this little eye icon. So I can just hide the red one, so we can just look at the blue one for now. Okay, so if you look at the path over here, as this is moving up and bouncing, there's this even spacing between each of the frames where this bounces. So if I select the keyframe at the top there and press F9, or if you select it and right-click and say Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. There's also Easy Ease In and Easy Ease Out. That basically just does the same thing, but only for the bit before or the bit after the keyframe. But Easy Ease just does it for the whole thing. And you'll see that the spacing sort of bunches up around that keyframe. So you get that sort of slow lingering thing at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next bounce at the top, select the bits, right click on it, keyframe assistant, easy ease. And then the next one, select the keyframe, and this time I'm just going to press F9. So you see on this path, all these top sections over here, I get that sort of bunched up spacing at the top there. It's basically the press F9 to make it feel better thing. If your animation is just feeling very mechanical and not interesting, doing that might improve things. You'll get a feel for where these sort of things will feel better with that. And yeah, as I said, in the advanced lessons, the last sort of 3 lessons, we'll go into like advanced specific ways to like emphasize that effect and stuff. If it's not perfect, don't worry, this is your first After Effects thing, so no big deal. Now we're going to do that sort of squash and stretch thing. So remember how I said to get the position value, you can press P. If you want to work with scale or rotation or opacity, there are keyboard shortcuts for that as well. I think in the future I might give you a whole list of keyboard shortcuts. I don't actually have that right now. But for this, it's really simple. If you want to work with scale, select your layer, and if you press S, you get the scale appears. Okay, I will get that keyboard shortcut list for next week. If you press R, you'll get your rotation values. If you press T, I don't know why it's different, but I think opacity, you'll get your opacity, and A for the anchor point. So you A, S, R, T, P. So those are all the standard ones. You can select multiple layers as well to get these things, so scale, rotation, opacity, position. And if you want to see position and scale at the same time, so I've got position now. If I press Shift plus S, then I'm going to see position and scale at the same time. So I can also say Shift R. So now I've got position, scale, and rotation. It's just a nice, easy way to work with your layer list here, especially when you've got like 100 layers and you don't want to dig in here to find specific layers, transform settings. You can just select a layer, rotation, scale, position. But for the keyboard shortcuts, for a lot of these things, not specifically those, but other things like the tool panel over here, if you just hover your mouse over it, you'll see it will say like selection tool V, zoom tool Z, all that sort of stuff. But I will give you a better list in the future. Okay, so if you want to get that squash and stretch, we're going to work with the scale. So we wanted to squish up at the start, stretch up in the middle, and then sort of return to normal, then stretch as it's going faster, and then squish when it hits. So if we just turn off the constraint proportion thing here, so the little lock thing, if we don't turn that off, we're just going to scale the whole thing up and down, which doesn't make for anything particularly interesting. So if we turn that off, then we can scale the width and the height separately. So we can add, what I'm going to do, I'm going to drag out all these keyframes just so I have a little bit at the start over here to work with. So where it sits and does nothing. So I'm going to add a keyframe at the start of just 100, 100. And then at the keyframe where it starts to take off for the first bounce, I'm going to scale down the height. You will see though that because of the way the anchor point is set up, it shrinks into the middle, which might not be what you want for your animation. You might have it already on the ground or something. So this is where you would want to mess with the anchor point. And for this animation, for sort of squash and stretch where it's hitting the ground, you might want to actually have the anchor point at the bottom of the object, because then when you do the squish with the scale, it'll scale down to the bottom of that shape. The only problem is you'll see that now it's moved the whole thing a little bit up. I'll show you how to solve that in a little bit, but let's just work with the scale for now. So it squashes in anticipation, and then it jumps, and then let's go sort of in the middle over here where it's going fast, and then just sort of make it longer but skinnier so that it gets that sort of stretch feel. Mine is going off the screen, so let's just make it a little bit smaller so you can see it. So squash, stretch, and then we can go into the middle over here and just make this 100 or whatever. And then you don't have to repeat this. You can just copy the scale for the middle, move to the bottom so where it impacts the ground. We can copy that squash again. So I went to the anchor point, so I pressed A to get anchor point, and I just changed the Y value to move the objects around its anchor point a bit. Hopefully that makes sense. I mean, for your animation, you might want it in a different position. It might be fine for you to just have it in the center. But it's nice when you want to impact the ground to have the anchor point at the bottom, because then it will squish when it gets down to that point. So for this, I'm actually going to move that stretch frame all the way close to this bounce point, because then you get that sort of more impactful sort of jelly effect. And I'm going to just paste that stretch in the middle over here. And just sort of repeat. There's no need to make all these keyframes from scratch when you can just copy and paste them. Make your lives easier. I haven't really refined this, but you get that sort of jelly sort of feeling from this. You might want yours to be more subtle, or you can go completely crazy and make yours like a big thing of jello. And if you really want to sell that sort of it being jello at the end here, you can sort of make some sort of wobbly sort of continuations with that scaling thing. So for squash and stretch to sort of feel right, you kind of want to conserve volume. Don't worry about this if it doesn't make sense. I'm just talking about like animation principles now. But like if you stretch it longer, you want it to get thinner. If you squash it, you want it to get fatter, if that makes sense. that's more for the sort of cartoony feel of squash and stretch. If you're doing a more realistic animation, don't worry about that. But it's all down to your intent. Okay, so just make sure that your layer is selected to get the anchor point. If you press the A key, that will show you your anchor point, and you can edit that to move the object around that little target point over there. So you can move it left or right or up and down. So that'll just change the point around which the scaling happens. Okay, I'm going to repeat that scaling and anchor point stuff now with this green one. So let's go through that all over again. So with my green solid over here selected, let me just go into the select tool. Oops. Okay, so we can see the path over there. When we scale it, by default, if we scale it now to stretch, it'll like go around the center of the object there, and that will like sort of change the animation. It'll like clip through the ground or something if you've got a little ground layer or something. So if we move the anchor point to the bottom of the shape, when you scale it, it will never get bigger below that point. So I'm just moving under the anchor point. I'm doing adjusting the second value over here. So there's the X and the Y. So the Y moves it upwards. There is also a tool if you want to adjust this visually instead of just adjusting these numbers like that. There's a tool at the top over here called the pan behind tool. I don't know why they call it that. Well, it's the anchor point tool. So it's got the keyboard shortcut of Y. If you click on that and you move an object, so go to an object, you can adjust the actual just the anchor point of an object, but the object stays in the same place. That's why I don't often use it, because you'll see that it's actually changing the keyframes as well. If I just move it around in here, it's easier to sort of get it more precisely, in my opinion. For you, maybe it feels better to use the pan behind tool. So you can just click and drag and move the anchor point itself. Okay, so then I'm just gonna create a little bit of animation over here with the scaling. And then I'm just selecting the top and bottom scaling so I don't have to do this repeatedly over and over. So just the same size when it squishes or stretches and stuff like that. You can, of course, manually go and do this as well if you want to have it vary a bit over time. So I just made this one look a little bit different, but it's basically the same process of stretching and squashing when it goes faster than it hits the ground, that sort of thing. Let's start off just scale 100, of course, just means full size. Anything above 100 will be stretched. Anything below 100 will be squashed. So if you have changed the anchor point and then the whole position of the animation is weird and it's now like going off the screen or something when you move it because of the anchor point, what you can do is just move the timeline indicator to one of your position keyframes. So it's at the same time. There's actually a little easier way to do that. When you've got keyframes on a property, you'll see that there's a little set of triangles and diamonds on the left-hand side here. There's a little right-hand one over here pointing to the right. So that will move the current time exactly to a keyframe. And then the left-hand one will move to the previous keyframe. And then actually the middle diamond over there is if you move just to a point in time, if you click that, it'll add a keyframe at the current time of the current value. So without actually having to change anything, you can just add a keyframe there. Okay, so to move the entire animation to somewhere else, just make sure you're on one of these keyframes and then just select all the keyframes for position. And then if you just move the whole thing now, all of those keyframes will move proportionally across the screen. If you don't have all those keyframes selected, it will just move it for that one little section, and then you'll get your thing jumping across the screen, which was probably not what you wanted to do. So you just select all your keyframes, make sure you're on one of those keyframes, and then you can move and make sure that it all stays proportional. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do today is just the last little flourish to this motion is to work with rotation. So we can just angle it to make the object rotate to follow the path that you're moving along. So it's exactly the same sort of thing. You just turn on the stopwatch, move to a point, and then you can either adjust these values manually over here like I do. Personally, this is how I do most of my things in After Effects. I just manually adjust the values. But to rotate, there is a rotation tool. So you see up here in the tool panel, it's the rotation tool, keyboard shortcut W. You can click and drag to manually, visually sort of change this to face wherever you want. Remember, this will always change it at the current time of the thing. So you can do it like this, move around, adjust it to sort of follow the path, and then when it hits the ground, manually adjust it, or if you type in a value of 0, then you'll know it will be completely flat. Well, for this specific object. Just remember, with rotations, it's angles over circles, so 0 will be the default, in this case facing up. If you do 90, it will rotate 90 degrees to the right. 180 will be flipped upside down. 270 will be 90 degrees to the left, which is the same as saying minus 90. So minus 90 and 270 would look the same, but it's when you're animating, it will make a difference because you'll rotate in different directions. I know I go on tangents a bit, but hopefully that makes sense to you. So position, rotation, scale are like the fundamental properties to animate with an object. So that's why we're just going with those today. If this isn't making sense, just keep practicing. The video will be uploaded at some point today, and I will send it to Martin, and he said he was going to put it on the Facebook group so you can see that. So you can go over this all over again, or if you had load shedding. But hopefully that's making sense. This is basically like the exercise that they would do for hand-drawn animation. It's just like the bouncing ball thing. It's a nice, simple way to just get used to animating. Okay, so those are the things that I wanted to cover today. If you have questions, I'm still going to remain here to answer your questions. If this is a-okay for you and making sense, this is when I would say you can pack your bags. But just the last thing, I do want you to save this because we are going to use this for the next lesson. So After Effects works with project files. So you just, under the File menu, Save As, and you can give it a name. We will go into issues that will arise when you save your projects, like on classroom computers, and try and bring them home. That can give you issues, but we're not going to do that today. You shouldn't actually be getting those problems nicely because you're going to be working at home this time, but it is important to know, especially when things go back to normal at some point and you're actually going into the Mac labs and stuff, taking projects from one thing to another. It will be important to know that. Okay, so any questions on any of that? You want me to repeat the whole process from scratch, doing the bouncing, stretching, rotation, any of that? Composition settings, moving keyframes, scaling keyframes, anything like that? Okay, so that's the first lesson. Just the basics of comps, keyframes, and just the transform settings of layers. So we'll start getting more complicated in the next lesson.